teach at Columbia Business School. I'm the Chavkin Chang Chair of Leadership. And yesterday we talked a lot about transformational cultural change. When you want to create a whole new normal in an organization, how do you go about it? Because there's a lot of layers of culture and you can't change them all at once. And the usual thought about that is you want to have the change be bottom-up grassroots change. You start by changing everyday behaviors and perceptions of those behaviors. Eventually then people start changing their values and ideals to fit the new behaviors. And then you lock it in with a change to institutions, policies, incentives. And if you try to start by changing the policies and incentives without building that base, it often fails. But sometimes leaders want to get change done really quickly. And so they want to use a different model, which is often called the shockwave model, or my colleague Jeffrey Sachs calls it shock therapy when it applies to countries. And the idea here is that you start with a change to the policies and institutions that sort of disrupts people's values and their habits, and then they realign their values, and eventually new routines and habits get put into place that can group. And you can only do this when you're changing something that you have a legitimate mandate to change as the leader. And a great example of this recently was Mary Barra. She became the head of HR just as GM was going into its bankruptcy and reorganization. So it was the end of an era. For most of the 20th century, it was the largest corporation in the world, sold the most cars in the world. That's what they took pride in. She realized, and that's going to have to change. It was very hierarchical, very bureaucratic. And so one of the first things she did when she took over HR was she knew the organization really well. She had started working there at age 18, inspecting fenders at a Pontiac plant. Her dad had worked there for 40 years. And GM had this really annoying dress policy that had grown to like 18 pages. It was a booklet with all these ad hoc additions, and most of it was about how women should dress, but it was obviously written by men, and most of the terminology was outdated. And so she decided, I'm going to throw away the dress code and replace it with a new dress policy, which is just dress appropriately, 2 words. So she announces this, and of course, the middle managers panic. They say, we can't, can you explain what dress appropriately means? And she said, no, the point is that each division is going to decide on their own what appropriate means for them, whether it's an assembly line or whether it's, the legal department. She wanted to drive decision-making downward because she wanted the organization to be quicker and more nimble and have more ownership of decisions. Now, she, a few years later, got elevated to CEO, the first woman to run a big 3 auto company. And while head of HR, she had started a process of appointing a committee to identify the new ideals and values that GM needed going forward. And so people were thinking about this, and they were polling their colleagues and sort of gathering information. And when the new ideals from the committee came out, they were things like be bold, innovate always, own it, which were things very much in the spirit of what she tried to accomplish. And then almost, in the opening months of being CEO, she ran into the buzzsaw of a safety scandal. There was an ignition switch problem that had been ignored, and it meant that cars sometimes shut off, which meant the airbag shut off. There were accidents, there were people injured. And so she said, now is the time to live up to these new ideals we've identified. And she led the process of doing a full inquiry of what were the root causes of this, and discovered that there were a number of routines that had evolved, like at safety meetings, nobody took notes, so there would be no individual accountability. And so she sort of exposed and extirpated some of these problematic everyday routines, and that changed. So it was change that started with an institutional shock, and then a realignment of values, and then finally changing the everyday values and routines.